Can you see my screen in full screen? Can anyone see my screen, my presentation in full screen?
Yes, sir. We can see.
Yes.
Yeah, great. So let's start, right? Okay. So wait, first, let's start with the idea of having the distance in between two data points, right? So yeah, you just don't worry, right? So it may seem a bit complicated, but this is just for the introduction, right? So this is because once you understand this Minkowski distance, you understand most of the distance measures that we are going to learn in today's lesson, right? So Minkowski distance is a measure between two data points like xi and xj, right? So the distance between these two data points is given by dij like this. So the first dimension of xi minus first dimension of xj data point, and we take the absolute value and take to the power of q, right? Q may be any number, right? And then we take similarly, like take the second dimension of xi and get the difference with the second data point and get the absolute value and take the power to the q, and so on up to the jth dimension. So suppose there are up to the p dimension, right? So suppose there are p dimensions. For each of the dimensions, we take the difference and take the absolute value, right? So maybe the j's value is greater than the i's value in a certain dimension. So then in that case, we take the absolute value and we take to the power q, and then we add all of them and take the qth root of the of that sum, right? So yeah, you may think that is a bit complicated, but so this is what that is a generic form of the Euclidean distance, right? So in Euclidean distance, what we do is we take the like we take the first two data points. Actually, these, so it stops with first two dimensions like the, and then we take the square of the differences, and we take the square root of the sum of all these dimensions, right? So suppose there are p like 5 dimensions in the feature space. So in that case, for each of the dimensions, we take the difference and we take the square and we add them and take the square root. That is how we get the Euclidean distance between two data points, right? For example, in the two-dimensional space, so if you want to take the orange data point, take the distance between the orange data point and the blue data point, what we do is we can use this Euclidean distance to find the direct distance between these two data points, right? So that is for the two-dimensional case. If it is multi-dimensional also, the same case, right? So you can get the straight direct distance. That is when q is 1. So this is a special case where q is 1 in the Minkowski distance. So when the q is 2, what happens is that q is the power that we take, right? So if the q is 1, we don't have to take the square root because it is 1. Square root, not the square root, the 1th root is 1, right? So you don't have to take any roots. You just take the absolute values and you add them. So that is the Manhattan distance, right? So it is like so if you want to find the distance between these two data points, you take the in this is the case of two-dimensional space, right? So you have to take the take each of the uh, uh, data points as situated in like highly populated city like the Manhattan, right? And if you want to go to this particular point to this particular point, so suppose these are the buildings, right? So buildings or the city blocks. So this is also known as the city block distance for the Manhattan distance. So in this case, you have to follow the path of the roads, right? So you can't directly go from here to here like in the Euclidean distance. Or Euclidean distance is something like you are using a helicopter to go from this point to this point. So when you're using a car, you have to go through the city blocks. So it is much to be much uh, lengthier, but you have to follow the x value. You have to add the x differences and the y differences, and that is how you get the distance between this point and this point uh, when you are moving from here to here. So this is another form of distance measure. Right? This is another form of a distance measure. So generally we are using Euclidean distance. In some cases we can use the Manhattan distance as well. So when you are taking the error values and so on, you may be already familiar with the Euclidean distance and like mean absolute values. So we can take Manhattan like distances as well. Right? So this is so not only q equals 1 and 2, you can take many different values for q and get some different measures in between two data points in a multidimensional vector space uh, when you are according to the requirement, right? So this Minkowski distance is a generic form of measuring the distance between two data points in a vector space. Okay, so first we will start with the k nearest neighbor algorithm, right? So this is another machine learning algorithm that we are going to learn today, right? This algorithm is somewhat different from the earlier algorithms that we have learned. Actually, this is very easy than the earlier algorithms we learned because the algorithm is also very easy, very simple, right? And also there's a difference between the earlier algorithms and this algorithm. So this is known as a instance-based learning algorithm. So that means you don't have to uh, make a machine learning model to make a prediction with this algorithm, right? So the other algorithms like linear regression, decision trees, and all those things are known as model-based algorithms, where you have to uh, build a model, train a model, and then using the model only you can make the predictions. But with k nearest neighbors, you don't have to make a model, but you just keep the data points in the memory. And when you want to make a prediction, you just do the calculations at the same time that you are making the predictions. Right? It means you don't have to collect data and run a batch process to make the model and then make the predictions when your predictable x values are coming into your system. But you in k nearest neighbors, you have to just keep the data points in the memory itself, and then you can make the predictions uh, using the you can make the predictions directly using the k nearest neighbor algorithm, right? So this is known as an instance-based learning algorithm. So the advantage of using this instance-based learning algorithm is that you don't have to create a model. That means it doesn't take time to make predictions when new data arrives into your system, right? So because of that, you can use this algorithm as a online learning algorithm. Online learning means when data arrives into the system, your machine learning model should get updated immediately. But if you are using a model-based algorithm, this is a bit difficult because you have to learn the algorithm, train the algorithm again and again when new data arrives. But with k-nearest neighbors, because you don't have to train a model, you just add the data point into the algorithm. You don't have to take time to train a model again, but you can directly make the predictions, right? So this is known as a lazy algorithm. But the disadvantage is that you have to keep all those data in the memory. So, and making prediction is also a bit computationally expensive compared uh, to most of the other machine learning algorithms, right? For example, if you want to make a prediction with linear regression, you just have to uh, in the memory, you just have to keep the parameters of the model only, right? So, for example, if it is a straight line in 2D space, you have to just keep the value of the gradient and the gradient of the slope and the intercept in the memory. But you don't have to keep all the data point values in the memory. But in this case, you have to keep all the values in the memory, and when a new data point comes, you have to make the distances within all these data points, and it is with computation, it is highly computationally expensive compared to other learning algorithms. So that is the disadvantage of using key nearest neighbor. So when you have a lot of data, this may not work because with the number of data points, the computational requirement also increases, right? So let's see how it works, right? So there, what we do is we find. So here also we have to define a hyperparameter known as k. That means we have to define a value. We have to set the value for this k value at the beginning of the algorithm. And in this algorithm, so your main assumption is that uh, nearby data points belong to uh, belong to the same class. So if you are taking it as a classification problem, right? So if you are trying to uh, make predictions of a classification problem using k nearest neighbor, uh, actually these k nearest neighbors can be used for both regression and classification. If you are using it for classification, the assumption is that nearby data points are uh, are belonging to the same class, and far away data points would belong to the two different classes, right? So that is actually the main assumption of k nearest neighbors and the clustering algorithms that we are going to learn in future slides, right? In today's lesson, so we will learn k nearest neighbor and the other clustering algorithm. For both of the cases, this is the main assumption. Where then if you find, so you first we take a distance measuring algorithm like a specific case of a Minkowski distance, like the Euclidean distance, and then we assume that nearby the lesser the distance between, or the lesser the Euclidean distance between 2 points, we assume that uh, these 2 points belong to the same cluster, and if the distance is high, we assume that these 2 points may belong to different clusters, right? So this is the main assumption of k nearest neighbor. So when we want to make a prediction, like so, we said that earlier that when in the k-nearest neighbor, we keep the positions of all the data points in memory, right? So when a new data point comes, what we have to do is we have to measure the distance from that particular data point to all the other data points in the memory, right? This is the first thing that you have to do. For example, if you have 1,000 data points, and when you all those 1,000 data points are there in the memory with their relevant vector locations or the space locate the coordinates in the multidimensional vector space, and suppose you get a new value to be predicted, so the distance between that particular point and all the other data points are calculated at the prediction time, right? And then so then you can sort the distances for each of the data points from that particular data point, and then we select the nearest k data points among the given data set. So that is why it is known as k nearest neighbors, right? So if we say that you have selected 3 as the k value, which is the hyperparameter that we have to select. So what you have to do is you have to find the least distant data points, least 3 uh, distant data points out of the data set, and then we can proceed further, right? So first we take the nearest uh, k data points. If the k is 3, we take the nearest 3 data points, and then if it is a classification algorithm, so what is the classification algorithm? We have to find what is the class that this data point belongs, right? That is what we have to do in the classification. So if it is a classification problem, what we have to do is we have to make a vote, right? Vote means so we have 3 data points we have selected 3 nearest neighbor data points, and each of the data points would have its own class, right? The real y value, and we would take a vote out of these 3 numbers, 3 k values, and if 2 k values say that this belongs to a certain data points, if it is suppose it's a binary classification, it may have negative and positive values. So if 2 data points are relevant to positive and 1 is relevant to negative class, so then we predict that the data point is a positive data point, right? So that is what we do when it is a classification algorithm. So in the regression problems, what you have to do is similarly we take the k nearest neighbors, we find what are the k nearest data points, and then we find the distance between distance for each of the data points, right? So we measure from this particular data point to the first data point, second data point, and third data point, when it in the case 3, and we take the average, right? Or there are some versions known as weighted k nearest neighbors, where we have to weight the distance from this particular data point to the other data points, because we know that distant data points are highly possible to be belonging to a different class, right? So only the nearest data points are highly correlated to the same class. So in that case, we have to add a lesser weight when the distance is high. Sorry, and we can add a higher weight for for the nearest data points. So with with weighted k nearest neighbors, we can define a weight measure for for finding the average value between the data points. Right? So it is like this. So let me draw something so that you can get some idea, right? So suppose that so this is the x1 and this is x2 and so on, right? So suppose these are the data points, right? So circular data points belongs to a certain class, and the x data cross data points belong to another class, right? So suppose a new data point uh, is to be predicted. For example, this is the new data point. So what you have to do is you have to take the nearest neighbors. Suppose we meet 3 nearest neighbors like this, and then we find that. So if it is a classification problem, you can say that because 2 data points belong to this X class and only one belongs to this circular class, this is also a X class data point, right? Or if it is a regression problem, we measure the distance between this point and this point, and this point and this point, sorry, and this point up to this point, right? Wait a minute. If it is this like this, so you can find the distance like this. So in order to find the regression value, you can take the distance with this one, and this one, and take the average of all these 3 values. So you will get a regression value, right? Not the distance, actually. You with this distance, if there's a weight, you can take the values of these classes, value of these points, and take the average based on the weights relevant to each of the distances, right? So I think I have mentioned earlier incorrectly, right? So we take the averages of the distance. So we take the averages to of the each of the data points, right, to get the regression value for x for this particular value, right? So if they are far away, we can have a lesser weight, and if they are nearby, we can have a higher weight for each of the data points, right? That is how we find the regression value. So now the problem is that you have to find the value for k, right? So what is this, right? So suppose so what is this k value? So I said that it is a hyperparameter, right? What would happen when the hyperparameter is low, right? For example, you can have k equals 1. That means there's only one. We take the nearest data point from this particular for the value for the data point that we are going to predict, and we assume that this is the we take the nearest data point as the predicted value. But the problem is it should have a higher variance, right? So that means the noise will also get apparent. Like suppose there is a some randomly defined outlier in your data set. And if we are going to predict some value in a region that is nearby for that particular outlier, you will get the incorrect value. So this should have a higher variance, right? So although it would be having a higher accuracy, the model is sensitive to the changes in the data set. If you have a higher k value, so then the differences between these two classes will get diminished, right? So suppose you have a k values like 6, 7 or something like that. So this should fade away the differences between the data points, because you are taking a too larger domain to average or to vote. In that case, it would have low variance but higher bias. Like we mentioned earlier, this is a trade-off that you have to find. So you have to find the best k value. So one of the best ways using cross validation to find the k value. Right? So now let's see what are the characteristics of k nearest neighbor. The first thing is that in k nearest neighbors, we know that we can have multidimensional vectors as the data points, right? Because when we are taking the distance measures, treating all the dimensions the same, treating all the features the same, right? So we consider that all the distances between all uh, the unit distances between all the features are same, and each of the features are also given an equal weight, right? For example, suppose that you are going to predict some the price of land or something, right? So there may be some highly significant features like the distance to the nearest main road and the area and so on. And there may be some less significant features like distance to the post office or and the elevation from the sea level and so on, right? So those may be less significant features, but if we are using k-nearest neighbors, all those features will get equal weight, right? So, and also, if you are using different scales like area of the uh, land in a very high number, like you are measuring it with square meters or something, and then you are taking the distance to the nearest main road in kilometers. So the scale would be highly different. So you have to scale the features before you apply the k nearest neighbors. Right. So when you are adding more less significant features, your model will get highly insignificant. Insignificant means there would be a problem of curse of dimensionality. So what is the curse of dimensionality? So suppose that you have only two features like x1 and x2. Your model would be able to classify data points highly accurately, where these cross data points are located highly in a highly distant position in the 2D data space from the circular data points, right? So these data points are close together, and these data points from here to here between two different classes are so distant, right? So two classes are very distant from each other, but in each of the class, inside the class, the distance is very long. So this property only exists in lower dimensions. So when you add more dimensions, like x3 and x4 and so on, so we can draw how x4, x5 are there, right? So then this difference, right, between the, I mean the criticality of distances is getting faded, right? In that case, most of the data points will be having a similar distance from each other. So then what happens is you will not be able to classify the classes based on the distances, because the assumption that we make during the k nearest neighbor, which you are assuming that the nearby data points belong to the same class, and the distant data points belong to different classes, will get faded, because when new dimensions are added, the distances between all of most of the data points will get similar, will get higher, and they will get similar. Because of that, you will not be able to easily classify the data points using KNN. So that is a problem with curse of dimensionality. In that kind of situation, you may be uh, able to use some dimensional reduction techniques known as principal component analysis. So we are not going to discuss in this module, but you may learn it in another module. Or you may be able to remove some of the features, like with the feature selection and so on, you can reduce the number of features, and you can, with feature engineering and so on, you can also combine some of the features, like the, for example, the length and the width of land, and you can make the area of the land to reduce the number of features, right? So that is a way of reducing the curse of dimensionality. So higher the k, so as I mentioned earlier, it becomes less sensitive to noise data points, because it would, but the problem is that it would increase the bias, right? So you have to find the k uh, in the correct way. You have to select a good value for k to have better accuracy for k nearest neighbors. So the other problem is, so suppose now uh, this is a classification problem, and you are voting. So what happens if the vote is tied? Tied means, for example, if it is a binary classification problem, uh, suppose you have only k equals 2, and both two data points are pointing to, one data point is pointing to the negative class, and the other data point is pointing to the positive class. So because of that, each of the number of data points uh, in each of the classes are same. They are tie-tie, right? So in that case, how to find the class? So one option is to uh, randomly select one of them, or the other option is that we can take the uh, distance for each of the classes, right? For example, if this is the value that this is the uh, point that I am going to predict, so these are the if the k is 2, suppose this is the k nearest neighbors. So but this data point is much closer, so although these two data points are pointing to different classes, and the vote is equal, because this data point is nearby, we take the class of this data point as the class of for this particular data point for our prediction, right? So this is based on the weighted distance. And this can be k-nearest neighbors can be used for online learning. Online learning is when the new data arrives, we can make predictions faster with the newly available data without making much more complex computations for training and so on. Because of that, k-nearest neighbor is good for online learning. So this is another example for k-nearest neighbor where suppose you can take the k as when you take the k as 3, you will suppose this is the class A and this is the class B, right? So if the k is 3, you get a narrower domain for the nearest neighbors, and the value will be the class B, right? So this is the new example to classify. So if k is 3, you find most number of classes are from most number of data points are from class B. So we take the class B as the class for this particular data point. Suppose you increase the k as 7, so then there are 4 data points in the as the nearest neighbors and 3 data points from class B. So because of that, you take class A as the prediction, not the class B when the k is 7. Now see, right? So we don't when it is a binary classification problem, we don't take even numbers because of the time problem, right? We take the even number, so odd numbers like 3, 7, 9, and so on, so that we will not have ties, right? Are there any questions up to now before we move into the clustering? You can ask if there are any questions with k nearest neighbors. Okay. So let's move into the unsupervised learning, right? Because clustering is an unsupervised learning problem. Unsupervised learning algorithm, right? So what is unsupervised learning? You may already know it, right? So when the labels are not there, like means the y variables or the dependent variables are not there, but only the x variables or the independent variables are there, then you have to make some analysis that is known as unsupervised learning. Means that supervised data or the y labels are not there. So why we are using unsupervised learning? Because it is cheaper and it is highly available, right? So when it comes to supervised data, you need to have y labels. So having y labels is difficult. So that means you need some previous data to train the model. Getting previous data may be difficult and expensive, and it is rare to find highly accurate y values, right? Because of that, if we can do most of the stuff with unsupervised learning, it is very good, right? For example, most of the large language models that you might have heard, right? Things like ChatGPT and so on, they can learn from huge corpuses. Corpuses means that huge text files without any manual labeling. So they use the sequence of data, sequence of words in the huge texts as sequences, and they use the unsupervised machine learning algorithm to train it as a large language model. So that's why it is very powerful, because you don't have to manually do anything to label the data. So the machine learning algorithm can automatically learn from the data itself. So because the data itself has some uh, relationships, have some patterns, the unsupervised machine learning algorithms can learn the patterns in the data without trying to optimizing into a given supervised uh, data set. Like it doesn't have to optimize into a label data set. It can automatically identify the patterns that are there in the data set. So because of that, if you can use the unsupervised learning, it's better to use it because it is cheaper. And that these kind of data are highly available. For example, if you want to make a AI model, artificial general intelligence model, so it will be very difficult to manually label the data and feed into a machine learning model. So that's why the AGI, artificial general intelligence, was not that much feasible in the past time. But once we have found how the large language models can learn as learn from the existing text without any labeling, that was the power it has gained with the techniques of unsupervised learning, right? So that is a very good example why the unsupervised learning is very successful and highly valuable when it comes to machine learning. So it is the power of unsupervised learning. So the clustering is one of the widely used unsupervised learning technique. And in clustering, we make the similar kind of assumptions where we assume that the data points belonging to the same cluster are located in nearby locations in the multidimensional vector space, and the data points that belongs to different clusters are located in distant data points in multidimensional vector space. Right. So in clustering, what we are going to do is that we are going to cluster the data points into each of the classes automatically. So the idea is that we assume that the data is naturally grouped into or organized into clusters in the multidimensional vector spaces. For example, so suppose this is the first dimension and this is the second dimension. So we assume that the data from one cluster is organized like this, and the other cluster is organized like this, where data belonging to one cluster are located in nearby locations, and data belong to two clusters are located in distant locations. So this is one cluster and this is another cluster. So what we are going to do is, given the data points, we have to automatically, with unsupervised machine learning, we are going to find that these data points are belonging to one cluster, cluster 1, and these data points belong to another cluster, cluster 2, or whatever the number, right? Cluster A or cluster B, or whatever the notation. Actually, we don't know what these clusters really mean, right? But we know that there is these two clusters belonging to two different classes. So that is the assumption, right? So, for example, so when suppose that something like customers, right? For example, you have an online website, like something like a eBay, right? So what you want to do is you want to make advertising campaigns for most of the customers, right? Now, in the marketing, there's a concept known as market segmentation, where you have to uh, identify different segments of customers which have different needs and different uh, mindsets, different opinions, different preferences, different buying powers, and so on. For example, children with who are educating, so they would be having some requirements to buy books and read newspapers, play games, and eat chocolates and so on. And when you take uh, younger population like uh, younger adults like 18 to 35, 40, so they will be having some requirement related to some other like jobs, finding some relationship related stuff, and some having fun and going parties and all kind of thing, right? So you have to uh, segment, so you have to differentiate the different types of customers. So but you may not know how to classify these customer segments. So machine learning using clustering, you may be able to automatically cluster the customer segments so that you can automatically identify them, and later you can provide advertisements relevant to each of the clusters and show them and get successful, right? So this is one of the examples of using clustering. So you can automatically find the customer segments using online uh, visitors who are visiting to your eBay like shopping website. So another example is human genome. So we know, right? Uh, our genes, there are many genes in our body, right? In a particular cell, and these genes, so these DNA, so it is consist of a thing called nuclei. So in the nucleus, there are DNA sequences, and DNA sequences are organized into uh, so into different uh, partitions. Only some of the DNA partitions are making the real work. The other parts are known as inactive DNA sequences. So the active DNA sequences are known as genes. So how to find the genes is also a problem, and you can identify what are the genes relevant to a certain animal like a human, and find what are the genes relevant to another animal like a tiger or someone, right? So you can actually uh, if you get a sample of DNA, you can find what are the DNAs that are what are genes relevant to tiger and human. So I am just giving you an example, right? So this application is much complex, more than that, right? So I am just giving you an example, right? For example, you can find what are the similar genes. So the similar genes may be doing a similar kind of functionality, like metabolizing the in the human body, and the reproduction or the cellular communication. So for each of the biological operations, the genes are similar genes may be having similar functionality. So you can't manually look at each of the gene and find this one belongs to this cluster and so on, because there are billions of DNA sequences. So you can use clustering for that kind of requirement. So the machine learning in clustering can automatically find what are the clusters of genes. And when it comes to, this is another requirement for clustering. Suppose you have a map, right? And you want to find the, so this is something like that, right? So you have a map uh, where actually it is a satellite image that you have taken from the space, where you can find the densely populated areas using the colors, using the lighting in each of the regions, right? In Colombo, you can see a higher light, and also it is relevant to higher population density. In India also there are, you can find the centers of higher populations with the higher light concentration. So these things can be found with clustering. You can make a cluster around Colombo area for the intensity of light, and you can find the model. You can make a model for population density or the economic activities of a particular geographical location. So that is another use case of using clustering. Okay, so now let's see what are the clustering algorithm types that we are going to use. So in basically there are different ways of categorizing the clustering algorithm, right? So I'm not going too much deep into this clustering, because in most of the cases you will learn about clustering in I think in another module known as data mining, right? So you will learn about clustering as well. So we will briefly introduce what are the types of clustering. So basically there are different ways of categorizing clustering. So in here I have uh, categorized into 3 different types, like distance based, density based, and model based. And let's understand each of the types, like, right? So the first type is known as distance based. So you know what is a distance, right? So distance is the distance between two data points in a multidimensional vector space, right? And nearby, the assumption is that the nearby data points belong to uh, the same cluster, and the distant data points may belong to different clusters. And here we measure the distance using one of the selected distance measure, like Euclidean distance. And you can use these distance measures to automatically define the clusters for each of the for all the data points, and then you would be able to uh, draw clusters around certain partitions of the data points in the multidimensional vector space. And that is the objective of using this distance based method. So as an example, we will introduce you this K-means clustering algorithm. So this is a different algorithm, right? So earlier what we have learned is K nearest neighbor, which is a supervised machine learning algorithm. So this one is so now we are talking about unsupervised machine learning algorithms. So this K-means clustering is a clustering algorithm, which is an unsupervised machine learning algorithm, right? So this is also a single level distance based clustering algorithm. So what is a single level? Single level means uh, in the future we will learn that there can be hierarchical levels as well, right? So that means when you have data points like this and like this, right? So one way is you can define clusters like this. Like this, and clusters like this. So this is one way of defining clusters. Another way is that you can define two clusters like this. Right, so in the green case, you have defined 3 clusters. In the orange color, you have defined 2 different clusters. So there are different ways of defining clusters around data points, because we don't know actually how many clusters are there in your data set. So this number of clusters is the number of k, right? So if you start, so in this k means clustering, the k is a hyperparameter that you have to define where how many clusters that you are going to define in the machine learning algorithm, right? So you can find different k values and find which k value, how many clusters that you have to cluster, right? Your data set. So in this case, so you can see if you have hierarchically clustered, so this orange color is in a higher hierarchy where there are only 2 classes. In the green hierarchy, in the green class, in the green cluster, sorry, in the orange cluster, we have 2 green clusters. So this is a hierarchical clustering, right? So inside the orange cluster, there can be multiple green clusters. So this is a hierarchical cluster. But if you don't have any multi-level clustering, this is known as single level clustering. So this is K-means algorithm is a single level distance based clustering. Okay. So the distance basis I have said, right? We assume that the nearby data points belong to the same cluster and the distant data points belong to different clusters. So that is the assumption in distance based methods. Right. So let's see what are the what is what we do with distance based measures. So we said that this is the so distance based clustering is also known as partitioning clustering, right? And as like in the k-nearest neighbors, features distances of each of the feature is assumed to be equally weighted while clustering. That means we assume each of the dimension is equally important, right? So if you have some less significant features, so that could reduce your accuracy of your model, because you have given the same priority of a less significant feature to a higher significant feature, right? So because of that, when you are using clustering also, you have to make sure that your number of dimensions are less, where you can clearly find the concentration of data points in different locations in the multidimensional vector space, instead of randomly uniformly locating the data points around the space, right? So it's like the stars or the galaxies that you see in universe, right? So you don't see the planets and stars all over the space, right? So you see the stars are concentrated in certain 3-dimensional space locations in the galaxy, right? And outside the galaxy there are almost no matter, and the planets or anything you can see, right? You can see they are concentrated. So when you are going to do some clustering, you have to do some exploratory data analytics and see whether your data set is clustered like that before you apply the clustering. So before you apply the distance-based clustering, right? So, and also because each of the features are given similar uh, weight, you have to make sure the features are scaled as well, right? So, generally we are using standardization as the scaling mechanism, right? So we have earlier mentioned what is Minkowski distance, and we have discussed what is Euclidean distance and Manhattan distance, and generally we are using Euclidean distance for measuring the distance, right? For K-means cluster as well. So actually we have learned these distances for K nearest neighbors, but for the K-means clustering algorithm, which is a supervised learning, which is an unsupervised learning algorithm, we are also using the same distance measures. And in the K-means clustering, the feature space, this is something specific to K nearest K-means clustering, right? Suppose we have two, two dimensions, two features like x1 and x2. Suppose you have your data points are located like this in the three-dimensional space. What happens is with clustering is that suppose you take 3 as the k number, right? That means you take you assume that there are 3 clusters in this space, right? So what would happen is the whole space, whole two-dimensional space which we are given will be divided into 3 different partitions, right? So this is one partition, this is another partition, this is another partition. So this is what happens when you are using K-means clustering. So the whole space will get partitioned into K distinct partitions for each of the clusters. For each of the clusters, you will have a point known as the centroid of the cluster, something like this. So which is a representation for the whole cluster, right? So maybe generally the centroid is selected so that it has the minimum total distance from the data points in that particular cluster. For example, if you take this cluster, the distances between this data point, this data point, this data point, this data point, and this data point, and this data point is minimum when you take the centroid as this location instead of taking it instead of taking the centroid as here, right? So if you have learned in other domains like civil engineering or something, you may already know that centroid is something like the center of gravity or center of mass. So in physics terms also, so the centroid is something related to the central measure or central point where we assume that the data points are concentrated. So the point which can represent the whole cluster. So where we generally we select that point as a point where the distances between each of the data points are minimum compared to other. So actually in this case we don't consider about other clusters. So we consider each of the clusters separately and we find which is the data point that has the least amount of distance from all the data points in that particular cluster. So that is known as the centroid of the cluster. Suppose you define K as 3. Now you will have 3 clusters like this. Right? So how to find these clusters? So generally what we use is we use the K-means clustering algorithm. So you may think why so that is what we are doing, right? I mean K-means clustering is the K-means clustering algorithm, right? Not exactly, right? K-means clustering is that you are making an assumption that you are dividing the multidimensional space into K clusters, right? So that is the idea of using K-means clustering. So how to find these K clusters for the given data set? So that is an algorithm that we have to use. So one of the algorithms that you can use is K-means clustering algorithm. Actually, there can be some other algorithms, maybe better algorithms that we haven't found for finding the K-means clustering. For finding K-means clustering, to do the K-means clustering or define K clusters uh, in the using any other technique. Right? So the K-means clustering is what we do, what we want to achieve. So how to achieve in the practical way, that is defined by the K-means clustering algorithm. So K-means clustering algorithm is a way of achieving K-means clustering. Right? So just remember it. Generally, no one will ask you. So those two things are separate stuff, but that is important that you know it. Right? So this is the K-means clustering algorithm. First thing is that you so suppose that you have defined K as 3, right? So first thing is we have to define K value. We take K as 3, for example, and we have to find the find the centroids for K data points. So what is the outcome that you are expecting from this K-means clustering algorithm? You are going to find the K centroid locations for the K clusters, right? So that is what we are expecting as the final outcome for learning the K-means clustering algorithm, right? So you will get K centroids for each of the K clusters. So the first thing is that you randomly define K centroids. So best way of randomly uh, defining the centroids, best way of assigning K centroids is selecting K data points randomly from the given data set. Okay, so now you understand the difference, right? So the first thing is you can define random K centroids. Actually, you can suppose if it is a 10-dimensional uh, space, you can define 10-dimensional random K data points. If the case 3, you can define 3 data points with dimension of 10. But the problem is when the dimension is 10, so or the dimension is so large, most of the data points will be highly distant from each other. In that case, defining random data points may not uh, converge in the way that you want. That means most of the space will be empty. The data will be very sparse, not dense. So they will be sparsely located, like how the like the air molecules are located in the free space, where you will find like one air molecule in one square cube of one square cube meter, right? So in the deep space, you would find that much of less density uh, in air molecules in the outer space. So if we are finding high dimensional vector space, the data would be located like that. In that case, if you define random k data points, those random k data points may not mean to anything. That means they may not be near to any of the data points. So they would also be random. So they would have no idea. They would have no relation with the existing data points. Because of that, it is better to instead of randomly defining the k data points, it's better to select k data points, in this case 3 data points, from the existing data set, right? Because the existing data may be related to all the data points, maybe should be related to any of the cluster. So having a data point inside the cluster is very important, right? So instead of finding some random data point, so that is the reason that why we are selecting a k centroids out of the data points that we already have, right? So that is not a mandatory thing, but this is a very important way of initializing centroids, right? And then what we have to do is we have to do a iterative algorithm until we converge into a certain state. So that is the K-means clustering algorithm. So what is the convergence case? Until each centroid data points stop getting changed, centroids or data points. That means uh, if the centroids that we have defined are not getting changed in the next iteration, that means we have come to a solution. Or if the data points that are relevant to the each of the centroids are not getting changed, that means for example, so suppose this is the centroid of this cluster and this is the centroid of this cluster. So cluster will be, the partitions will be like this. This is the first partition, this is the second partition. So these data points belong into this centroid. These data points belong to this centroid. So in each of the step, what we are going to do is we are going to find the centroids of these data points, and for each of the centroids we are allocating the data points. So that is the two steps that we do, right? The first step is that we assign each data point to the data set to the nearest centroid. Assign each data point in the data set to the nearest centroid. So suppose that we assign some centroid here and here, and then we allocate for which centroid this data points belongs, right? And then the second step is for each of the centroids, for each of the clusters, we define the centroids again, right? So yeah, let me explain again, right? So in this algorithm, so what we are doing is we are making these two steps again and again iteratively until either the centroids nor the neither the centroids nor the data points get changed which related to the clusters, right? If the centroids are not changing, that means we have come to the final solution. Or the data points are not getting assigned to another centroids, again, that means we have come to a solution. So until that, we have to iteratively these two steps. The first step is assign each data point to the data set to the nearest centroid. So first we randomly define two centroids, and then we assign each of the data points to the nearest centroid, right? And then what we are going to do is, so once we have assigned the data points to the centroid, that means all the data points assigned to that particular data point, that particular centroid will be considered as a single cluster. The data point, the centroid, this is the centroid for the second cluster, and we assign these data points to the second to this centroid. These data points are now belonging to the second cluster. So now the second step is we find the centroid again. So we initially had some centroid, then we assign data points to these two centroids, and then again for each of these clusters we find what is the centroid. So we find what is the least distant data point, so or the mean square Euclidean distance for all of the data points in the cluster, and we define the centroids again. Then we again assign each of the data points into the centroids, and again find the centroids of these clusters. So when the centroids are fixed or the data points are not getting allocated to other clusters, to other centroids, the algorithm will get finished. This algorithm is also converging. Converging means it is not going to diverge. That means it would not keep running and running infinitely, and it would converge to a certain solution, to an optimum point. But this optimum point is may not be the global optimum. Right? It may be a local optimum point. So as we have learned earlier, right? So we can have when it comes to the cost function, we can have cost functions like this, right? Like j beta is the cost function with the values of beta. So this one has the least cost function, but this one is also having a least cost function, but this is a local minimum. This is the global minimum, right? So we will not be able to find so if we have started from here and moving in this direction with this algorithm, you will come to this point, but not this point, right? So this K-means clustering will converge into a suboptimal solution. But the optimum centroids will be different if we change the initial centroids in a different way, right? So suppose that we have defined centroids in a certain way, you will define the clusters in a different way, and if you define the clusters in another way, you will have clusters in a different way. So you can define the random centroids in different phases. That means you can run this K-means clustering algorithm several times with different random allocations of centroids, and you can take the best clustering algorithm, best clustering solution among the selected among these models, and that is the that may be the global optimum point. So you can run this clustering algorithm for different k values, and for each of the k value also you can run it with different initialization points or different random centroids, and then you can find uh, what is the best way to make the clusters, right? So there are several ways to find the k value for the k-means clustering. The first thing is using the simple value, like suppose if n is the number of data points, you can take as n over 2 square root as the k. So that doesn't have a meaning, right? So n can be different. And the other ways, you can change the value of n, sorry, change the value of k, change the value of k like this, and you can find the cost. So this elbow method says that if the cost is reducing like this, and at a certain point, the cost is reducing like this. So it is like an elbow where you take this point as the optimum k value. But most practical people in this field says that this elbow method is not a good method to uh, define the k value, because in general this is not how it really happens, but it would be something like this, where you would not be able to find the real elbow point like this. So this elbow method will not be practical. So the best available way is to use k-fold cross validation. Uh, so or you can actually define, you can you can know about the domain, like how, for example, if you want to cluster the customers, suppose now you want to uh, cluster males and females, right? Male customers and female customers. Now you know only there are only two genders. Because of that, you can define k as 2. So you don't have to use some k-fold cross validation or elbow method to find the k. So with that knowledge of domain, with the domain knowledge, you can define the k as well. And or if you have some intuition about the domain, the application domain, then you can find how many clusters should be there in this data set. So that is one way of defining k. Or you can use k-fold cross validation. This elbow method is not, it is said to be not that successful in practical scenarios. So this is a visualized example of using k-means clustering algorithm. So just look at it. So if you haven't understood what they have said about k-means clustering algorithm, you can follow through each of the steps and find how it is defined. Right? For example, in this is the original data set, the step 1, and we take 2 data points and define them as centroids. So we randomly select 2 data points. So these two are the 2 data points that it has selected, randomly selected, right? So these 2 data points will get, this is another one centroid, this is another centroid, right? So then what happens is the data are allocated to each of the centroids based on the least distance. So the blue color star will get allocated these 2 data points and all these data points, because this data point is the nearest data point among these 2 data points for each of most of these data points, all of these data points, and these are the data points that are nearest to This is the data point nearest to all of these three data points. So this green color belongs to another cluster and the blue color belongs to another cluster. So again, the second step is that then we have to assign centroids again. So now you see that this blue star is not in the center of this cluster, right? So it should be somewhere here. Okay. So after this iteration, so after the second step, you will find that it has moved here and it has come to this point. And for this cluster also, you can find the centroid of these 3 points is not somewhere here, but somewhere here, right? So it has to be moved somewhere here. So it has moved to this particular location. Again, we go to the second iteration and we assign the data points to the nearest data points to the nearest centroid. So these data points will be assigned to this centroid, and these data points will be assigned to this centroid, right? So now you can see these data points will get also assigned to this centroid, and this data points will be assigned to this centroid. And again, in the second phase of the second step of the second iteration, we have to define the centroids. So this centroid should move into somewhere here, and this centroid should be moved into somewhere here, right? So it has moved here. This has moved here, right? And now we try to again assign the data points into these two centroids. You will find that all these green data points are allocated to this green star, and all these blue data points will get assigned back to the blue star. So now data points have not changed their centroid. Because of that, we know that now that the K-means clustering algorithm has finished. So this is the final K-means clusters. This should be the centroid of this cluster, and this should be the centroid of this cluster. This is the K-means algorithm in brief, right? So now you can learn that there are some problems with K-means algorithm, like there are some limitations, right? The first thing is that let's first say that what is the advantage? So the advantage of K-means clustering is that it is fast, because the algorithm is simple. It can run efficiently in computer. So that is the advantage. So the disadvantage is that it has to be K-means works correctly only when the clusters are well separated, circular, and having the similar sizes, right? When each of these three conditions are violated, K-means clustering may not work as we want. So suppose when the classes are not well separated. For example, suppose these are the two clusters. This one is the first cluster and this one is the second cluster, where the classes are not separated, they are mixed together in this region, right? In this case, but with the K-means clustering, this is the partitioning that what has really happened. So these data points has belong to this cluster, and these data points have been identified as belonging to the green cluster, which is not correct because the classes are not separated enough. and the other requirement is the k-means clusters has to be circular. So suppose these are the cluster boundaries. So suppose these are the clusters, but because they are not circular, they are having some rod-like structure. Once you have started the centroids like this and this, the partitions would be defined as these would be the partitions, not the way that we wanted to have, right? When the clusters are not circular. So that is another problem. Another thing that you have to remember when you are applying k-means clustering. You have to apply the k-means clustering only when the classes are circular. And also the classes should be in the same size. Suppose in this case, one cluster is in the k-means clustering. This is how the clusters are defined. The blue cluster is actually when you are looking by your eye, you know this is one cluster, and the remaining data belong to another cluster, right? You know, right? So this is how the clusters should be defined in the real world, in the red way, right? But how the clusters are defined by the k-means clustering is according to the yellow boundaries, right? That is the problem. And the k-means and the data counts should also be similar, because if one cluster has less number of data points and another cluster has lot of data points, the centroids would be moved in a different location so that the data points are almost equally distributed among these two clusters. So this cluster and part of this cluster are now considered as a single cluster, and these data points are considered as another cluster, which is not correct, right? So the data size should also be same or similar in order to before you apply the k-means clustering. Otherwise, it would not be working correctly. And also, instead of using k-means clustering, there are other clustering algorithms like k-medioid clustering, right? So you can learn it by yourself. So which are single level cluster. Single level cluster means there are no clusters inside another cluster here, as I have shown earlier. Okay? Another type of clustering is that, as I have mentioned, the hierarchical clustering. So there are two types of hierarchical clustering known as agglomerative clustering and divisive clustering. So agglomerative clustering means we start. So suppose this A, B, C, D, E are the data points, right? So with agglomerative clustering, we start each data point is a cluster, and then we agglomerate or combine these two clusters into the nearest cluster with the nearest cluster, right? These two clusters into this cluster, these two clusters into this cluster, and this cluster are nearby, so we combine these two, and this cluster and this cluster are nearby, so we combine them all together in the final step. So all would be belonging to a single cluster. So So this is a hierarchy of clusters when it starts from the each of the data points and go to the and end up having a single cluster. This is known as agglomerative clustering. So Agnes is an example for agglomerative clustering. So the other way of hierarchical clustering is in divisive clustering. So where we start as all the data points belonging to a same cluster, and then we divide these data points into two clusters. And in this point, we divide this cluster into two clusters, and this cluster into two clusters. And the final stage, at the step 4, in the divisive method, each data point will be belonging to a different cluster. So this is in both of the cases, this is the hierarchy. So it starts from start with the root of where all the data points are belonging to a cluster, and at the leaf it would be each of the data points having its own clusters. So this is a hierarchy of clusters. So there are different ways of different algorithms to define these hierarchical clusters. So we are not going to discuss much about it. So the problem with distance-based clustering that we have explained earlier, both single layer and the hierarchical, problem is that outlier data points are affecting the clusters in a considerable way, right? Because if there is a these are the data points, and if there is another outlier here, this would be hugely affecting the centroid of this data point. So it would be somewhere like here. Centroid would be located to point like here because of this data point. But this is not correct, right? So because of this single data point, the centroid of all the data points have been affected in a significant way. So this is the problem with distance-based methods, right? So and also it's impossible to cluster highly non-circular clusters as well, right? For example, in the we have seen that we can cluster the densely populated areas in Sri Lanka using the lighting conditions that you can see from the space, right? So in this kind of scenario, you see that these areas are not circular at all, right? So you can't use K-means clustering or something to cluster the highly densely populated areas in the map using the lighting. So in that kind of scenario, you can have to use some other techniques. So density-based method is one of them, right? And also with distance-based methods, you have to, especially in the single layer techniques, you have to define the K value. So we don't know actually how many clusters are there, but we have to define a K value. That is also a downside of distance-based clustering. So, but when it comes to density-based clustering, we only consider the local density. That means for each of the data point, we take a local domain. We find how much similar data points are there in this local region or the neighborhood. That is how we do the clustering. So that is so I am not going to explain how it is done. So you better go to this dbScan link. So it explains how the dbScan works, right? So dbScan is a good example for density-based clustering because we don't have enough time. So this is a very good example for density-based method for clustering data points based on the density of data points in the particular vector space. And optics is an extension of is DB scan algorithm. So that is recommended when you are using in the practical world for your machine learning requirements. So density based methods can be used widely because in real world data are not really circular, well separated and equally counted data sets like we do in k-means clustering, but they have arbitrary boundaries, different data points, highly different data points in different densities, right? So on. And because of that, density based clustering can be highly useful when you are using it in practical use cases. So you can use either DB scan or optics. So between these two, optics is highly recommended as a density based technique. Right. And there are other types of so we have learned about distance based methods and the density based methods, and the third one is known as model based methods. So what are models? It is something like that. So in the earlier clustering, we assume that all the data points are belonging to a one cluster, right? So that means uh, this is the data set. This data points belong into this cluster, and these data points belong into this cluster. Not like a certain data point belong into, including this one, right? Not like one data point belong into two clusters at the same time, right? But in real world, that may be a case, right? There are data points that may belong into more than one distinct cluster. In that case, we can use these model-based methods. So in this case, we assume in model-based method, we assume that each data point is assumed to be generated by a mixture of probability distribution. Right? So that means this particular data point may be resulted from a mixture of probability distribution. So these probability distributions are the models, are certain models, and it has set of models. So the collection of probability distribution is the model, and this model has generated this particular data point, not a particular cluster. So the clustering is a very simple thing, but in reality, there can be situations where the data points are generated by two different distributions. For example, suppose you have an aeroplane, right? And there are two engines. So you check the vibrations in a certain point, measure the vibrations in a certain data point, and you find two different frequencies or some particular signal pattern, two different probability distributions that you can observe from this particular point. So these points may be related to the noise generated by this particular engine or this particular airplane engine, or it may be a combination of these two. So this vibration is not directly selected by either one of them. It may be a collection of these two engines. So in this kind of scenarios, these model-based techniques can be used to model from which distributions, in which proportion these distributions are there, and what are the distributions. And that is the idea of finding the model-based techniques for clustering. So it is not a general form of clustering, but a much advanced form of clustering. So expectation maximization algorithm is one of the highly used algorithm in this model-based techniques. So in expectation maximization algorithm, there are two phases. So one is known as expectation phase and the other phase is known as maximization phase. So in the expectation phase, the algorithm, for example, suppose your data set is generated by a Gaussian distribution like this, and another Gaussian distribution like this. So your distribution, your final distribution you view or the data you get would be something like this, the blue color. But in the underneath, there are two Gaussian distributions that are generated in this blue color distribution. What you observe. So you observe the data points relative to this blue color distribution, but in underneath, there can be two different distributions that are generated in this blue color distribution. So what we want to do is, using the data points that are there in this blue color data point, we are going to find the parameters and the proportions of this green color distribution and the red color distribution. So in order to do that, what we do is, for each of the data point that we observe, somewhere here, here and so on, we assign how much probability that each data point would be generated by this green color data point and this red color data points. And in the maximization phase, what we do is, we set the parameters for this blue color and green color distributions based on these probabilities that we have already set in the expectation phase. Right? So that is actually a continuous version of the k-means algorithm. Okay, so you may be a bit confused, right? So don't worry, right? So you go home and just go through it again if you are interested, and then you will find, right? So this is an extension of the k-means like algorithm, right? So instead of like allocating the data points to the centroid and defining the centroid again, you do these two steps again and again in each iteration, right? So this expectation and maximization are also the same, also similar, right? So you assign the probabilities that are generated. So in which probabilities each data point is generated by each of these distributions in the expectation phase. In the maximization phase, we update the model parameters to maximize the likelihood of the data given in these probabilities. So this is also convergent like in the k-means algorithm, where you would go to a local minimum and you can do it several times with different initialization values, and you may be having a better final outcome. So that is how the expectation maximization algorithm works. So, and this Gaussian mixture model is an example for expectation maximization algorithm. So the parameters for this Gaussian mixture model, so you can have a mean vector, covariance matrix, and the proportion of the distributions. That means if you take this red distribution and the green distributions, each of them will have mean values. Each of them have variance, right? And each of them have proportions. So this has a lesser proportion, this has a higher proportion, right? So we have to find these three values. So because it's a set, because there are different distributions, it would be defined as a mean values as a vector. The covariance as the variance would be they are not in between those two distributions, between each of these values. So it would be a covariance matrix, and proportion of distribution, it would be a set of weights. How many proportion is there for each of the distribution? And so we initialize the parameters randomly like we did in the K-means algorithm. And in the E step or the expectation step, we find the proportion of each of the data points to be assigned to each of the distribution. And we estimate the parameters like we assign the centroids in the M step. What we do is we estimate the parameters and update the Gaussian distribution with parameters. So we iterate in between these two steps like we do in the K-means clustering algorithm until we come to a convergence point. This is how the Gaussian mixture model works. So this is also a model that is used for real world applications in engineering and some other natural phenomena. This case can also converge to a local optimum. So once converged, so we have to update how each data point is generated. So if it is generated, so one thing is that we can assume that each data point is generated by a single distribution. So that is known as the maximum probability rule. So we assign which probability was assumed, which data point was, which distribution generated that particular data point. So this is known as the maximum probability rule. So we take the highest probability and assign the cluster, because ultimately what we want to have is a clustering, right? So with these Gaussian models, what we are going to do is we have to allocate these data points into clusters, right? So we can use the maximum probability rule to assign the clusters. In some cases, the data points can be assigned to multiple clusters as well. So as I mentioned earlier, we can have data points that are belonging to more than one clusters. So this is known as soft assignment. So that is also possible. So in the soft assignment, you can visualize this, how each data point is assigned to each of the distribution using a heat map. Okay? So that is something much generic than the other clustering algorithms. Right? So suppose these are the Gaussian models. So there are three Gaussian models, and this one is the Gaussian mixture model. So this Gaussian mixture model is a addition of all these three Gaussian models. So what you are going to find is you have to first find the mean values, variances, and the proportions of these distributions, and then we find how much each of the from which cluster it belongs. You can either assume that this generated by a single cluster and use this maximum probability rule, or you can assume that this data point may be caused by a combination of more of these three clusters. So you can assign that particular data point into multiple clusters as well. Okay, so now let's see how to evaluate this cluster. So unlike in supervised machine learning, right, when you are evaluating clustering, you can't actually evaluate what is the accuracy correctly, because you don't have labels. So because you don't have a labeled data set, you can't have a test data set, right? So in order to evaluate the accuracy, you have to have what is the correct output, right? So that means, for example, in the clustering, you should have some test data to validate, so that you can say, okay, this data point belongs to this particular cluster. But we don't have any clusters in our as our test data, right? So actually we don't have any test data because all the data doesn't contain any y labels. So without y labels, you can't have test data. Without test data, you can't evaluate. But looking at the data set, you can have some evaluation measures, like how much data is distributed in the multidimensional space. So if your data is if your data set is clusterable, right? Clusterable means if your data set can be clustered into multiple clusters, they should be distributed in different locations, space locations in higher densities, right? So as I mentioned about the real space, where the galaxies and stars are concentrated in the matter in the universe, in the multidimensional vector space also, you should be able to see the concentrated data points in certain locations in the multidimensional space. If not, that means if the data points are uniformly distributed in the space, that means it is not clusterable. So we have to find how this is known as spatial randomness. This can be measured by Hopkins statistic. So you can go to this link and see how it is measured. And also you can, when you have done them, so that is how to measure whether the data, how much the data can be clustered. So in order to measure, once you have done clustering, you can measure the quality of the clustering. If you have the data sets, so generally, as I said, in unsupervised learning, we don't have a test data set, but if you had got a data set, you can use these extrinsic methods like B-cube precision and recall, right? So recall, you know it, right? So you can see how many data points are correctly classified, how many data points are retrieved correctly from this model. And the precision, we can use this B-cube precision. And when you don't have enough data, if you don't have data that have labels, you have to use intrinsic methods. So we don't have labels, you don't have ground truths. So ground truth is a name that is also used for real values or the y labels. If those are not there, you can find how much the data is there in what is the intercluster distance and the intercluster distance. So intercluster distance means what are the distances between data points in a cluster, and what intercluster distance means what is the distance between the clusters. So with these measures, you can find some measure about the accuracy of these clusters, or the performance of these clusters that we have generated from our machine learning algorithm. So you can apply these measures like this example. You can go to and watch what is how to use this seal out coefficient, and use the seal out coefficient to measure the accuracy of the clustering once your machine learning model was trained. Okay, so that is all about today's lesson. you can, if you have any questions, you can ask or you can start the tutorial. Thank you.